hope you guys are ready. Tonight is history lesson night. Um, but it's cool because as we get into Daniel chapters 10 and 11, what we see is the incredible detail of prophecy that's there. And so much so, as we'll see, a lot of people think that, well, this was written during the time of the Maccabees or during the time that Antiochus Epiphanes was there and wreaking havoc in Jerusalem, and this was propaganda stuff that was being written to kind of spark the rebellion, so to speak, of the Jews there within the city against him. But there's one thing we're going to look at that's recorded for us in history that makes us say, I don't think that can be so. It's had to be written beforehand, and so we'll see that here in a moment. So let's jump into some prayer here real quick before we get into the Word. And then be ready. If you're a note taker, have 2 pencils ready to go tonight because there's a lot. God, we are grateful this evening just for an opportunity to dig into your word. And God, while there's a lot of facts and a lot of things that'll be flying tonight, God, the thing that we need to take away and the thing that we need to remember, God, just how in control you are. Not just in control of history, but God, in control of the future, in control of our future. God, you don't just concern yourself with kingdoms and world events, but God, you concern yourself with us and the day-to-days of our lives. And God, we are so grateful for that and so grateful that you are there and that we know and trust that you are in control. God, even when things are happening and even when we can't figure things out, even though it doesn't make sense to us and we wonder why you're doing what you're doing or allowing what you're allowing, God, you have a plan. God, you know best. So, Father, it's your will that we trust. So, God, we just want to make sure as we look into your word tonight, we're seeing your sovereignty, your control, way that, Father, we can bring you glory in going with your plan and trusting that you have the best in mind. So, Father, help us see that tonight. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. So Daniel chapter 10, we're just going to start and kind of push through some of this. We'll be reading some of it verbatim. We'll be paraphrasing other bits of it. We'll be interjecting here with some history to kind of give you the understanding of how some of the prophecy was fulfilled. The prophecy that we see here tonight, it's not hard in and of itself to understand. There's not a lot of imagery like some of the other visions that we've seen. We're not looking at goats and rams or statues made of different pieces or things like that to figure out beast with horns. What we're looking at tonight is simply Daniel is given a vision of kind of a broad brush of things that were getting ready to happen. And what we have to understand, and it's like we saw with the goat and the ram, if you remember, Alexander played into that vision. He was just a tiny piece, wasn't he? Because the major concern was that little horn who was going to have specific implications for Israel and Jerusalem. And it's the same sort of thing with this vision that Daniel will get tonight. There are going to be other characters, other things that are happening at the time, some of the things that maybe were much more interesting or had much more impact on a large scale, on a global scale, but that's not what God's people needed to understand and see. God needed them to understand his control in their future and what was going to be happening with them so that when they saw these things, they would see prophecy being fulfilled. They would see that, hey, God has this playing out exactly like he said it was going to. And so as we begin to look into Daniel chapter 10, he gives us kind of a time frame. Verse 1 is written kind of by an editor, someone, a compiler, someone who's putting all of this together. It says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. And that word was true, and it was a great conflict. And he understood the word and had understanding of the vision. And then as we get into verse 2, we actually get the recording of what Daniel had recorded of his vision and the instance of his vision. Now notice in verse 1, the writer tells us that he understands the word and he has understanding of the vision. Now, as I said, the words that we're going to see tonight, it's not hard to understand what's being said. Not a lot of imagery or supernatural or vague imagery that's given. But notice he has understanding of the vision. This says Daniel knows what it means and what he's talking about. But Daniel didn't have it immediately. Daniel didn't have it immediately. By the time this was compiled and put together, he did. He was able to explain. He was able to tell them what these things were talking about and what was going on, but it didn't all make sense to him immediately. And we'll see that as we look at what Daniel says about it in verse 2. It says, "In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks." And in verse 3, he says, "I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for a full 3 weeks. And on the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river," that'd be the Tigris River, "as I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist." And he goes on to give us this description, and we'll get there in a moment, but notice he's giving us particulars. He's giving us these historic particulars of his vision, where he was, when it was, and what was going on. Understanding why he's mourning right here could give us a little bit of an insight into why this vision is so important. It's the 3rd year of King Cyrus. We've talked about Cyrus. We've talked about the significance of Cyrus. Cyrus was actually prophesied by Isaiah many centuries before. What was the significance of Cyrus? What was his role with Israel's history going to be? What was he going to do? Who remembers? We didn't build the temple himself, but Cyrus is the one who gave the edict or gave the decree for them to go back and build. For them to go back and build. And so this is the 3rd year of Cyrus. That happened during the 1st year of Cyrus's reign. And so the group, if you read in the Old Testament book of Ezra, that group would have been the group that went out back to Jerusalem to begin work on the temple under Cyrus's reign. But if you read the book of Ezra, you know that as they got to Jerusalem and began to sift through the rubble and move out the debris and began building and began work there in the city, they weren't met with enthusiasm from their neighbors, were they? And it was hard work. It was hard emotionally because of what they were seeing when they got there. It was hard because you know as well as I do, starting a project from scratch is much easier than starting a rebuilding project from something that's been destroyed, right? Because before you can start a rebuild, you've got to get rid of all the junk and everything, right, that was there before. There's always extra stuff that has to be done. You always run into more issues and more complications. And so they had those sort of issues. They had those sort of complications. They couldn't take back with them all the resources that they needed, so they had to acquire resources. There were neighbors that did not want to see Jerusalem rebuilt. If you remember, they were sometimes even being raided by these people who were around. And so within a matter of months of them being back and getting the project started, the project grinds to a halt. And it's actually about 15 years before construction begins again. And so the 3rd year of Cyrus would be shortly after work ground to a halt, and probably a dozen years before work would begin again. And so you can see that as Daniel is in a state of mourning here, and mourning for 3 weeks, what is he mourning over? This would be a time of mourning. This would be a time of distress. This would be a time of disappointment for both the Israelites that had returned to Jerusalem and those who were there in Babylon that knew they had gone back and were anxious to see the work happening. And so Daniel, certainly being in a royal court, is privy to what's going on, the letters that have come in, because if you'll remember, those who opposed the work in Jerusalem were writing letters to the king and questioning what was being done and making false accusations about the Jews who were back there in Jerusalem. So Daniel's privy to all of this and all of these things that are happening. And so it's not surprising that he's in a state of mourning. It's not surprising that he's fasting and beseeching God. And so you'll notice that as he's doing this, it says he lifts up his eyes and he beholds a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold. His body was like a beryl. His face, and when I say beryl, I'm talking the gemstone, not a barrel. That would be his chest or his belly if you're me, right? But his body was like a beryl. His face was like the appearance of lightning. His eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but, notice this, a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled and hid themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in a deep sleep with my face on the ground. Some people have taken this description and tried to figure out who this is that he's seeing. Some people will say, well, he's seeing Christ. Talk about the gleaming eyes, the glow like torches. You look at his radiance, the sound of his voice being like a multitude, or the multitude of waters or thunders, depending on the translation you're reading there. And while some of those descriptions certainly are applied to Christ at times in Scripture, I don't think that has to be him here. And I don't think it is him here because of part of what he says here in just a moment. But instead, if you look in Ezekiel at his vision that he has of the chariot that moves the throne of God, and you look at the creatures that are the ones who are moving this chariot around, listen to some of the descriptions with them. These cherubim have the form of a man. Now, we know that they also had some animal characteristics or animal faces, but still, their overall general form was that of a man. They had the appearance of torches. Their limbs gleamed like burnished bronze. They moved like flashes of lightning. Their wings produced a mighty sound that sounded like the voice of the Almighty. There's that sound of multitudes or roaring waters. And notice that later in Ezekiel, if you remember, he sees this angelic mediator who's sent to Jerusalem to mark those who aren't going to be destroyed or aren't going to be taken in judgment. That angelic mediator was clothed in a robe, as he's talking about here. Says, he has some of those same radiant features or torch-like features. So this very well could just be one of the cherubim or one of the other angelic beings that he's seeing. And we know that this person, as Daniel begins to speak to him, says that he is sent to him with a message. And as we look down in this, he was sent to him with the message on the day that Daniel began to seek God for an answer and beseech God about this distress and this mourning that he was in, about the state of his countrymen, about the state of Israel, what was going to happen. And yet, whoever this person is that he sees is held up for 21 days. He's held up by the princes of Persia. And we said a couple weeks ago that idea, that phrase for prince, we think of spiritual principalities, those not necessarily all God's angelic beings, but even dark or fallen beings, right? And still those princes and principalities and rulers of the air, right? Scripture talks about. So he says he's held up by the prince of Persia. And Israel's prince, Michael, the archangel, right, that's responsible apparently for Israel and their spiritual warfare and spiritual well-being, he has to come to his aid so that he can leave and bring this message to Daniel. I don't think it's Christ himself. I don't think that's who he's describing here. I don't think Jesus would need help against the prince of Persia to come and bring Daniel a message if he so chose. And I don't think he sent like a messenger quite like that. And so Daniel has this vision of an angel who speaks to him. And he says that no one else sees this person there, but this great sense of fear or awe comes over them so that they trembled and fled to hide. But if you think about Paul's experience with Christ on the road to Damascus, wasn't it sort of the same thing? They may have seen the light, they may have heard a sound, but they couldn't make out what it was. They couldn't understand what was being said. They didn't know what they were seeing. It was the same sort of sense of awe to them. And yet Paul alone, or at that time Saul, actually heard the message and heard what was being said. And so it's the same sort of thing here that's happening here for Daniel. And so Daniel is given this message, and his response as he sees this and hears the voice is that he prostrates himself, right? On his hands and knees. And in verse 10, it says, "A hand touched me and setting me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me, O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you and stand upright. For now I have been sent to you." And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. And he said to me, "Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before God, your words have been heard, and I've come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what it is to happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision is for days yet to come." You heard that with his last vision that we looked at 2 weeks ago. But what's interesting here to me is this. Daniel's words were heard on the day that he prayed. But 3 weeks later, he's getting the answer. We don't always get the instantaneous answer to prayer that we want, do we? And sometimes it's because we're not ready. Sometimes I think God has to lay the groundwork or do a thing to bring about the situation and the circumstances that he wants to be in place, or prepare the person that he wants to be a part of that answer to prayer. But I think sometimes spiritual warfare does play into it. It certainly did here. And so God dispatched this messenger with an answer on the day that Daniel began to seek for an answer, but it was 21 days before the answer arrives. And so notice Daniel's faithfulness there. He was not going to let this go. There was a persistence and a faithfulness on his part to keep seeking after God and seeking this answer. Notice what he didn't do. He didn't turn to mediums. He didn't turn to self-help gurus. He didn't turn to YouTube. He didn't turn to anywhere else to find an answer to what it was he was looking for from God. When God didn't give him the answer instantaneously, Daniel was persistent. Daniel was faithful, and Daniel continued to seek after God to find this answer that he knew only God could have. And so we need to have that same type of tenacity, right? And that same type of faithfulness as we're seeking God and waiting on God to do what only God can do. And so in 15, he says, "When he had spoken to me according to these words, I turned my face toward the ground and was mute. And behold, one in the likeness of the children of man touched my lips." Now that's not saying this is the Christ, the Son of Man, but this is saying one like the children of men. That could have just simply meant he had a youthful appearance, or at the very least, he at least had a human form. He didn't have the awe-inspiring, supernatural look that this other angelic being had. He looked like you or I would look. And we know angels can take that form, don't we? We saw whenever Abraham was visited. He certainly knew that it was a heavenly visit, but they appeared from a distance as he saw them approaching as men who were approaching where he was camped. And that's what they appeared as they went into the city. Because as they go into the city and they go into Lot's house, what do the other men of the city do? They go knock on the door. They don't say, "Where are these angelic beings that came to visit you?" What do they say? "Where are these men who came in?" So they have that appearance. And so that's all that this is getting across. That this is another angel in another form, maybe of another rank or another type of angelic being. But this one, it says, touches his lips. "And then I opened my mouth and spoke, and I said to him who stood before me, O my Lord, by reason of the vision, pains have come upon me, and I retain no strength. How can my Lord's servant talk with my Lord? For now no strength remains in me, and no breath is left in me." And it's amazing to me that he can speak and not have the breath or the strength to speak. You ever had anybody tell you, "I'm speechless"? You're obviously not, right? But that's essentially what Daniel was saying here is, you've left me speechless. How can I say anything? And it says in 18, again, one having the appearance of a man touched me and strengthened me. And he said, "O man greatly loved, fear not, peace be with you. Be strong and of good courage." And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened, and I said, "Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me." And then he said, "Do you know why I have come to you?" Certainly, Daniel knew if he was bringing an answer, what he was seeking an answer for. It says, "But now I will return and fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come." Now again, this idea of prince, he's not talking about the actual men who are sitting on thrones. He's talking about spiritual principalities, those who are there behind the scene. He says, "But I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth." In other words, I'm about to give you an answer. What was Daniel seeking? What was going to happen to Israel in the latter days? And then remember, he says it's for a time that's not yet to come. It's in a time still in the distant future. He says, "There is none who contends by my side against these except for your prince, Michael." So that means that this angel that's speaking to him is not in charge spiritually of the warfare involving Israel and fighting on their behalf, but he has another role. He has a different position. So then we get to chapter 11. And here is where he begins to tell him what is written about Israel's last days in that book of truth. Now he tells him a little bit about himself. We get a little glimpse into the role of this angelic being. He says, "As for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him." You say, well, why would one of God's holy angels stand up and confirm and strengthen a pagan king? Who was it that marched into Babylon and became God's instrument of judgment against Babylon? It was Darius. And so we've said God sets up kings and he tears down kings. Well, how does God set up a king and make him successful, make him dominant in battle, and give him military victory? We get a little glimpse behind the curtain here. This angelic being that he sees with the beryl face and the glowing eyes and the radiant limbs that look like they're burnished bronze, he says, "I stood up and confirmed and strengthened Darius the Mede." But now he's in opposition with the prince of Persia. Those angelic beings, those ones who are pulling the strings, those ones who are leading the kings and enticing the kings to do evil and to do things against the will of God. And so he's contending with them. And so we see behind the scenes as we look at our leaders and we look at the leaders of nations, there is a warfare that's going on there. We're told to pray for our leaders, aren't we? And we're told that God can use them to do his will. But there's warfare. There's a battle that goes on there. Do you believe that there's a battle that goes on for what you do and what you think and how you act and your attitudes each and every day? Now imagine that you are placed in a position where you are the king of a nation. Who do you think Satan himself is sending more of his number ones to? You or the White House? So there's this battle that goes on, and there's prayer that's needed. Because we see that God has people in position. He has his angels in position, but Satan certainly has his in position as well. There's this battle raging as to what's going on. And he says, as far as it is in Persia right now, it seems that no one else is standing for God, no one else is believing, no one else is following. Michael, the prince, the archangel of Israel, stands alone with this angel, whoever he is, fighting for God's plan. But in verse 2, he begins to deliver his message. He says, "And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them." Now, depending on how you want to number these and depending on how you want to cut it, some English translations put 3 more, others say 3 kings. If you look at the history here of the kings in Persia, there would be 4. If you don't count Cyrus, then there are 3. If you are counting Cyrus, the way that you get to that number, there was an imposter king who was on the throne for a very, very, very short time when he took it illegitimately. But if he wasn't really the king and wasn't really recognized and wasn't really put on the throne and put there by God, then he doesn't count. But regardless of which way you look at it, notice after Cyrus, there are 3 kings that sit on the Persian throne till we get to Xerxes. And notice what it says: the 4th shall be far richer than all of them. If you are familiar with the book of Esther, this is the king of Persia. This is Xerxes, who took Esther to be his wife. And so he had Persia taken really to the pinnacle of where they were as an empire. There were other kings after Xerxes, but really they were kind of the garbage time kings. Y'all are sports fans and familiar with that term, garbage time. Really, that's what it was for Persia. Because once Xerxes decided that he was going to go to war with Greece, he didn't let Greece come to him. He tried to march on and invade Greece, and he was soundly defeated at the Battle of Salamis. And from that time on, Persia was in a steady, rapid decline as an empire. And so there would be a few other kings that would take the Persian throne after him, but at that point, the Persian Empire was inconsequential because Greece was now the world power. And so what Daniel was told here is there would be 3 more kings that would rise in Persia, and then a 4th would be far richer than them all. And notice what he says about this 4th king. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. And that's exactly what Xerxes does. He gets a little too big for his britches and decides that he's going to go on the offensive, and he's routed. But what's interesting is notice what the messenger told Daniel even before he begins to speak the prophecy here in the vision here. He says that I'm going to go back, contend with the prince of Persia, and after I go out, what? The prince of Greece will come. He kind of foreshadows that even before he gets into it. But then we get into verse 3. It says, then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do all he wills. Now, this is a very brief mention, but this is Alexander. Daniel would understand this in understanding the previous visions that he's had. And if you'll remember the goat with the single horn, the very unique, specific horn in the middle of its forehead that went against the Mede-Persian ram with the 2 horns, one was which was longer, right? Same principle, same guy. This is Alexander. And so people will say there's no way that Daniel could have known this supernaturally. There's no way this could have been written beforehand. This was written by somebody who has sought through the history books. It's later on in Greece's reign in Jerusalem, and they're looking back at what happened and writing about it until they get down to where they are. They're trying to rally the troops. They're trying to bolster morale. But here's the thing. You guys familiar with a historian by the name of Josephus? Josephus was a Jewish historian, born somewhere around about 37 AD, a few years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. He was a Jew, wrote histories of kind of the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of the temple in 70 AD, but he endeared himself to a certain Roman emperor, Vespasian, and got himself passage to Rome. And while in Rome would write histories of his people, recent histories, but having access to the imperial libraries and books that had come hundreds of years before him, all of this at his fingertips, he compiled histories of the Jewish people from centuries and centuries and centuries before. Some of it was written in a way that was very flattering for the Jewish people. Some of his accounts of Old Testament teachings He put his own spin to take anything negative out of it. If you're reading the Bible, you know that God leaves all of the negatives in there, right? Because all of the warts and all the wrinkles are part of who we are and part of the beauty of how he still works with us and chooses us anyway. Josephus would leave those things out and paint it in a much better light. So sometimes you have to be a little careful when you're reading some of those things, but what he is great at is giving us and preserving for us pieces of history that were in works that we no longer have access to. He made no bones about quoting from and pulling pieces from other books that were out there during his time and had been around for centuries, firsthand accounts and things, lists of kings and lists of rulers and lists of taxes and censuses and all of these things. He had access to all of this that he would use to compile his histories. The reason I get into that is because he gives us in the Antiquities of the Jews an interesting encounter that the Jews had with Alexander that shows us that Daniel had to have been written. Even if it wasn't written early in the Persian Empire, it had to have been written before the fall of the Persian Empire. He says this, now Alexander, when he had taken Gaza, made haste to go up to Jerusalem. And Jaddua, the high priest, when he heard that, was in agony and under terror, as not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians, since the king was displeased at his foregoing disobedience. He therefore ordained that the people should make supplications and should join him in offering sacrifices to God, whom he besought for protection of the nation. Now it goes on, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here in this account, but essentially what he's saying is, as Alexander is sweeping toward Jerusalem, victory after victory after victory, this high priest, who historically we know was the high priest at the time, knows that Alexander is going to be coming into Jerusalem. And he knows that they haven't been obeying the law in ceasing to worship in their traditional Jewish ways of worship and offering the sacrifices and the incense. And so they're terrified of what's going to happen when Alexander gets there. So basically, he calls for a time of public prayer and sacrifice. And it says that he says God appeared to him in a vision that night and told him not to fear, that everything was going to be okay, but everyone in the city should dress in white, and the priest should absolutely wear their traditional Jewish getup, just as if they were serving in the temple. All of the jewelry, everything. And they were to go out and meet Alexander as he was coming into the city. And so that's exactly what he does. He musters everyone in the city and gets them up, gets all the priests decked out completely. I mean, think of the Day of Atonement. It would have been full regalia, everything that they would wear. Now, that's kind of counterintuitive. If he was already worried that they were going to be punished for not observing Greek religious practices and observing the Jewish religious practices, why would they put on from head to toe a visual representation that we're thumbing our nose at your law and we're doing things our own way? But instead of cowering inside the city, they do something that no one else was doing. They go out and meet Alexander as he's coming in. And so it's interesting, because it says that the approaching army wanted to plunder and loot the city and torment the high priest to death. But the opposite happened. And this is what Josephus said. For Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priest stood clothed in fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with the mitre on his head, having the golden plate on which the name of God was engraved, he approached by himself and adored the name and first saluted the high priest. The Jews also did all together with one voice salute Alexander and encompass him about, whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done and supposed him to be disordered in his mind. However, Parmieno alone went up to him, that was one of Alexander's military advisors, and he asked him how it came to pass that when all the others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews. To whom he replied, I did not adore him, but the God who hath honored him with the high priesthood. Now notice this. This is what Alexander says. For I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, or his regalia, his priestly attire, when I was in Dios, in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me in a dream to make no delay, but boldly pass over the sea thither, for that he would conduct my army and would give me the dominion over the Persians. Now notice, this isn't the high priest that he's seen in the dream. This is the God who ordained the high priest that he's seen in his dream. This is the God of this high priest who's telling him that he's going to give him dominion over the Persians, and that all things will succeed according to what is in my own mind. And when he had said this to Parmenio, and had given the high priest his right hand, the priest ran along by him and came into the city. And when he went up to the temple, he offered a sacrifice to God according to the high priest's directions, and magnificently treated both the high priest and the priest. And when the book of Daniel was shown to him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended, and he was glad. And he dismissed the multitudes before his presence. But the next day he called them to him and bade them to ask favors, whatever they pleased of him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they may enjoy the laws of their forefathers and pay no tribute on the 7th year. And he granted all that they desired. So here, Josephus gives to us a historical record that he was privy to there in the imperial library of Vespasian, that says that as Alexander comes into Jerusalem, he is shown the book of Daniel and shown this prophecy that they believe is about him and he believes is about himself. And Alexander, showing his gratitude for God giving him this confirmation that he would succeed against the Persians, offers a sacrifice there to God. Now, does that mean that I think Alexander was a good practicing Jew from that point on? No, not at all. But understand what we're getting. Here is an outside historical reference, a secular pagan historical reference. The book of Daniel being a book of antiquity and not a book that was written after Antiochus IV came into Jerusalem. And if that is the case, then even if the 3 kings and the 4th being the richest of them all wasn't written until after that happened, Alexander and anything else that's in this vision has to be after. You see where I'm going with this? It has to be prophetic. And now watch the detail that the rest of this is fulfilled in. And we're going to go quickly through this. I know I don't want to keep you here all night, but we could. It says, and as soon as he is risen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided to the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, there we go, his children. Or according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. We talked about this with Alexander with the last vision. If you remember, Alexander had 3 possible heirs. One was a half-brother who was mentally deranged and not fit to be on the throne. Another was a son of an illegitimate marriage who would have never been given the throne. And another who was killed before he could have ever had the chance to be put on the throne. So it wasn't going to go to any of his posterity. And what ended up happening to Alexander's empire when he died at a very young age? It was split between 4 generals, weren't they? And there were constant war and infighting within them to see who could solidify and who could own the biggest chunk of the empire. And so it's 2 of those that we begin to talk about in verse 5. Why don't we talk about the other 2? Because they really don't have any bearing on Israel and the history or the future of Israel. But there are 2 that he begins to talk about. Verse 5, it says, then the king of the south shall be strong. That would be Ptolemy. Where was Ptolemy? What part of the Greek Empire was he in? Egypt, right? But one of his princes, Seleucus, shall be stronger than he, and he shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. So one of his princes rose up, desired power for himself, so he actually went and took with force the portion of the empire that was kind of in the Middle East, Syria, that area. And so he becomes, if you think about a map, well, I'll do it for you all. If Egypt is here and the Middle East is here, as we're talking about the king of the south, we're talking about the Ptolemies in Egypt. As we're talking about the king of the north, we're talking about the Seleucid Empire there in the Middle East. And so when we refer here in these next several verses to the king of the south and the king of the north, that's what we're talking about, those empires. So verse 6, it says, after some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. What's it talking about whenever it's talking about the strength of the arm? Their sway, their power, their influence, right? So she is sent to the king of the north by the king of the south to make a marriage alliance, right? But what is he hoping? She's a strong-willed woman, and she's going to convince him to do what daddy wants her to convince him to do, right? And so he has a way to exert some influence there. But notice what it says. She shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. In other words, he's not even going to last, the king of the south. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her and he who supported her. Given up, by the way, means dead, okay? And from a branch from her roots, one shall arise in his place. So her roots were with the king of the south, right? So the one who fathered her won't make it, and one from her roots, so someone she's related to, will rise up in his place. And he shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. And he shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. A lot of detail to go on right there in this little vision, right? And we're only partway through it. But in 250 BC, Ptolemy II, who was ruler in Egypt, sent his daughter Bernice to marry Antiochus II, who was king of the north. The plan was for Antiochus II to divorce his current wife, Laodice, and marry Bernice. So that's what he did. Laodice didn't like the plan. So she poisoned Antiochus II. And then she had Bernice and the child that they had had together killed, and all of the attendants that had been sent from Egypt with her to serve her while she was in Syria. So her arm lost its power, and his arm didn't survive, right? Just like they said. But what about the branch from her own roots who would rise up? Well, her brother, Ptolemy III, took the throne in Egypt whenever Ptolemy II died. And for revenge for his sister, Ptolemy III led an expedition of forces, a massive force, into the fortress and defeated Antiochus II there and brought back all of the spoils of the temple to Egypt. Just like the angel told Daniel it was going to happen. And after that, they did cease to fight each other for a while. It says, then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south. So that means that now the king of the north is at some point going to the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. Because of problems at home, the revenge tour didn't happen. He had to turn around and go back. But then in 10, it says, his sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north. So see what we're getting here in these next few verses? It's just a constant back and forth. For over 100 years, that's what was happening with Egypt and Syria, just constant, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, going at each other. But then we get down into 14. It says, in those times, many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not stand, and even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. When Antiochus III decides to invade Egypt again, this time Ptolemy V is on the throne. Antiochus III, on his way down, banishes Egyptian forces that are controlling the Holy Land and takes control of Israel and the surrounding area. And leaves a garrison there and then moves his way on down into Egypt, where he does topple Ptolemy V and forces him to submit to him. On his way through the Holy Land, the Israelites were tired of their treatment by the Egyptians. They were tired of the way that they were being taxed. They were tired of the way that they were being taken and forced to labor, all of these things. And so to them, Antiochus III was a liberator. And so as he came through fighting the Egyptians, those who were hungry for war in Israel sided with Antiochus III and helped them throw off the oppression of the Egyptians. That's one of the ways that he was as successful as he was on that march through. So what did he say? The violent among your own people, right, shall lift up themselves to fulfill the vision. But after Antiochus III is in power, Israel realizes nothing's really changing for them. He's just as bad, if not worse, as the Egyptians. So they think, well, we'll throw him off too, only they don't succeed. It says, many shall rise up against the king of the south. And so that's who they were talking about. But notice it says when he gets there, he gets into Egypt, it says, he who comes against him shall do according to his own will. And so as he comes back into the Holy Land, that's exactly what he does. He now has an iron grip on the Holy Land. And he is ruthless with the way that he treats them and the way that he treats the people who are living there. 17, it says, he shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, that it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Afterward, he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortress of his own land, that he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. So after Antiochus III subdues the Holy Land and subdues Ptolemy V there in Egypt, there's only one direction left for him to go. He decides he's going to start moving up the coast, up the Mediterranean coast, and start making a move toward Greece. Remember, he's trying to unite all of what used to be Alexander's empire again. So he's subdued Egypt, he's got the Middle East himself, and now he wants to start spreading up toward Asia Minor and Greece. Well, as he does that, he gains some help from Hannibal. You all are familiar with Hannibal of Carthage. But there's a Roman general who outsmarts them all, Lucius Scipio, and he defeats Antiochus on his way into Greece. And so while Antiochus musters this huge force to go in, he's beaten by a smaller army and he's humiliated. And not only that, he no longer has the resources to keep the campaign going. So he has to turn and go back. But he doesn't want to go all the way back home. He wants to get as many resources as he can, as quickly as he can, so he can turn and head back toward Greece again for another assault. So he stops in Babylon and raids the temple there of any wealth and any resources that he can find in Babylon. And when he does that, it absolutely infuriates the locals who are there, and they kill him. So remember what it said. He shall turn his face back toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall, shall not be found. And so that's exactly what happens. But here's where we catch up to where we were the last couple weeks. Verse 20. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. You remember after Antiochus III, the older son took the throne, but was only on the throne for days before mysteriously he died. And in his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. That would be his brother Antiochus IV. Or as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, Antiochus Epiphanes. You remember Epiphanes, he declared himself to be the very revelation of God. That was the title that he chose for himself. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with the small people. Remember, as we talked about Antiochus a few weeks ago, one of the things that we said is he was a hated man and a despised man, and so he tried to buy people's affection. And so he would take money from the treasury and go out into the villages and just cast out gold for the villagers and the peasants there. So the little people loved him. They had no idea who he really was or what he was really like or the way he was in politics. We don't need to go all through Antiochus here tonight. We've talked about him. And here in this vision, we see a lot about him that we've already seen. The type of person he was, the way he was going to do things. But after he captures Israel, after he sets up the pagan idol to Zeus there in the temple, after he sacrifices swine there on the altar, there's more to his story. And so we'll get there next week. So next week we're going to try to wrap up 11 and then into chapter 12. And chapter 12 will be the end as we get into the end of the book of Daniel. But what I want you to see tonight, look at the detail that's going on here. Is God not amazing? Just how sovereign he is, how much control he has, how much wisdom he has over the events of the world. And if he can get it right in these things, do you think that relationship you're worried about is outside the realm of his understanding? That diagnosis you just got, is that outside the realm of his understanding and his power to deal with? If he can know exactly what's happening, if he can work it all out, bring about his end, situations like this, can he do in your life exactly what he wants to do and needs to do with you to get you where you need to be? Get you doing the things that you need to be doing for him? We could trust him. And that's what he was trying to get across to Daniel. That's what he was trying to get across to the Israelites who were still here in Babylon, looking at what was going on. The way work in Jerusalem was grinding to a halt. God, you made all these promises. We were going to go back. We were going to rebuild the temple. You were going to rebuild the city. You were coming. You're sending a king. We know all of this stuff, but God, it's all just stopped. God says, trust me. Here's what's coming at a latter time. And I'm giving you this, but it's for many days yet to come. But trust me. If you need a little bit of something to chew on between now and then, here, I'm going to give you broad strokes. These are all the big things that are going to be happening over the next several hundred years. You just watch and see if I don't make them come true. Trust me. That's what he's telling us tonight. God bless you guys. We'll see you Wednesday.